This is Dr. Carpenter. I'm going to read through and comment on a case study that one of your peers did in the past and which is a strong case study. So first of all, you see that the student has a title page in the correct format. It's got a running head, which is APA style. It's got a number and it's got a title. You probably might come up with a title that doesn't involve the phrase case study, but it's not the end of the world. You do need some sort of title, though, for the case study. Okay, now this author chose to start with the researcher's instrument statement, and that's fine. It's sort of up to you. I'm not saying that I am recommending starting with the researcher's instrument statement, but that's just the decision that this particular writer came to. Obviously, in a researcher's instrument statement, it is appropriate to be using I. We generally don't want to overuse I in other parts of the body of the paper. The first paragraph here is more of an introduction to the paper, I would say, than actually a researcher's instrument statement. So it might have been appropriate to just move this heading down here and just called this an introduction. The researcher's instrument statement is really supposed to be about your subjectivity and how it may have affected your interpretation of what you saw in the case study. After a semicolon, or sorry, after a colon, we don't need a capital letter. If we do a list like this, we would need the and for the last item in the list. So this first paragraph in the researcher's instrument statement does a nice job of pointing out specific things about the author's point of view that they brought in to the case study that are helpful to me as a reader to know. Oh, God, what are we going to replace you with? Began. Avoiding absolutes. So in general, that's a fairly good researcher's instrument statement. The author points out that he came from a school that he thought represented some of the same diversity that was going to be at the school for his case study. And then he talks about how it turned out that partway through the case study, that didn't turn out to be the case. So it's honest, and it puts on the table the author's perspective and how it may have affected his interpretation of the case. Now, since I already added in the title introduction, I'll just say So this is interesting. I like how it's pointed out that Ricky's attitude towards being bilingual is different from his stepfather's, apparently. As we've talked about in class, some students can see what school does as a threat to their identity, but Ricky seems to see at least bilingualism as an opportunity, as something that's additive. It will be interesting to see here if later in the paper the author does talk about how the environment of Smithville is not particularly welcoming to Latino immigrants, particularly given the actions of the sheriff's office. So we'll see if that comes out in the context. So in this case, I would just like more specific language. What do you mean? This is a little vague. But it's understood at this point that we're introducing the subject, so later on, maybe that will be built upon. Okay, so the context, I like how we have some subheadings within the context that organizes the discussion of context. Clearly, with a Latino student, the national environment and political debate around immigration is an important topic, so it is appropriate in this case to zoom out and talk about context at a macro level first. We don't need the 2009 here because it was already up here. APA, once you have the date presented on a citation, you do not repeat the date within the same paragraph. So everything that is in this context paragraph is indeed relevant. I would consider adding something about the debate around immigration that is ongoing in our country. I would say given is probably not the right word here. Not sure if this year is right since we had it previously being 2009. No, if it were the same citation, this is a new paragraph, so we would include the date. It's a little bit of personification. A state cannot exhibit hostility. The state's laws might exhibit hostility, or the state's people, or the state's culture. You could say something like that. But the state is not an entity that can exhibit hostility. This sentence is nicely done in terms of it doesn't engage in absolutes. It qualifies the idea that there is some hostility, and then talks about how you do not have to have uniform hostility for it to have a negative effect on students. And then this is key. So the content of the context is being directly connected to Ricky. So remember, we don't want to go multiple paragraphs without referring to our case study, student or students. The word significant can be tricky because what qualifies as significant is somewhat subjective. I would argue that 13% might be considered significant. This perhaps is a bit of an overstatement. You can have schools that have a healthy integrated culture, and so we don't want to assume that an individual would be at a social disadvantage just because his particular group is a minority on campus. Now, it may well be the case that in a particular individual's experience, they feel at a social disadvantage, but we may be jumping to a bit of a conclusion here by saying that just because of certain demographic numbers, the student would be at a disadvantage. I like the focus zooming in. So we've gone from national to state to local, and local we started at the school level, and now we're getting to the classroom level. So a nice logical flow. I also like how this paragraph links clearly to the paragraph before. The author is doing a nice job of leading the reader along. This is an important observation, given that certainly this might not be the case in all classrooms. In some schools, in some classrooms, students using a second language are treated with hostility by majority group or English first language students. Now here's a place where Ricky is clearly at the center of this paragraph, and I do think, though, that a quote from Ricky could really strengthen this paragraph. So it's asserted that this classroom is a place where he feels safe, he feels like he belongs, and so maybe a quote from Ricky, if there were a relevant one, could strengthen this paragraph. So this is a good practice in your case study. If you point out a specific behavior from your student or students, it's good to compare that behavior to the class norm. Avoid absolutes. This is debatable, but it is a thankful fact that the bell ringer is not related to the day's instruction. I understand the author's point, but instructionally speaking, it might be stronger if it were actually connected, and it might result in the students paying more attention to the bell ringer. Good here to include a specific example. This would be a point somewhere in this paragraph. I'd like to see a quote. It is perfectly acceptable to summarize the case study student's perspective on various things throughout the case study, but there should be a balance of you as the author summarizing the student's perspective and providing direct quotes. This assures me that your interpretation of the student's perspective is valid. It's a perceptive analysis, I think, of this word skills part of the curriculum. It's interesting that it feels detached and is not integrated with the flow, regular flow of the class. This is a good observation that even though the book could be seen as relevant by the students, it is simply presented as a requirement. Again, this would be probably prime territory for a quote. Legitimately irrelevant is probably redundant. This is a good observation. I also like the use of seems here. If we're just observing attentiveness, we can't know for sure that the student is actually being attentive. This is a nice use of an outside source. You don't have to use outside sources in your case study, but where appropriate, they can definitely add some value. And this is a case where the author is bringing something in that they've learned in another class. So in general, the initial sections of this paper have done a good job of establishing the context and discussing curriculum and the student's perspective on it. There's regular connections to the student, and I would say probably the main improvement that needs to be made at this point is some more direct quotes from Ricky himself.